Hey guys, how's it going? So I come to you for the Nonfiction BookTube Tag. This was created by Olive over at BookOlive, who is the host of Nonfiction November. I'll leave a link to her video. I was tagged by 4 different BookTubers, although if anyone else has tagged me and I haven't realized it, then just let me know and I will correct it in my description. But the BookTubers that I know have tagged me are Lindsay over at Lindsay Reads, Peg over at the History Shelf, Brian of Bookish, and Brianna over at Brianna's Library. So thank you all for tagging me. I will get to the questions. Number 1 is, how much nonfiction do you read? I think if you were to count by individual books, if that were the way you were counting, then I think I would be somewhere around 40% nonfiction to 60% fiction. But if you were to count by pages, page count, then I think that it might be reversed. I think it might be 60% nonfiction to 40% fiction. And especially if you include the nonfiction that I read that isn't necessarily entire books. So like when I read individual essays or brief lives, but like the lives of Plutarch or something like that, which don't count as books but are still, obviously reading, then I definitely think nonfiction would have the edge in my reading life. Number 2, what kind of nonfiction videos do you make or do you want to make on BookTube? I incorporate reviews of nonfiction books into my, Friday reads, wrap-ups, and other things, and I talk about Friday nonfiction books in tags quite a bit. I also do individual review videos of nonfiction books occasionally. When I do those videos, it's sometimes hard for me not to just talk on and on and on about the subject matter instead of actually, actually reviewing the book, and I actually have a lot of fun with that. In terms of what videos I might like to make about nonfiction, I'm pretty happy with what I do, I guess. I like talking about them in review videos, and I like talking about them in wrap-ups. The one thing I can think of, perhaps, is to read like 3 different books on one particular issue or subject that have 3 different perspectives, and talk about each of them in one video. That might be interesting. But yeah, honestly, I'm pretty happy with where my nonfiction content is at the moment. Number 3 is, what is your favorite subgenre of nonfiction? This is hard. If I were talking about just pure enjoyment, the kind of books that I just rip through because I just, am loving them page by page, it would be memoir, definitely. But if I were talking about the nonfiction that I like the most in terms of the subject I like to learn about the most, it would probably be religion, followed closely by opera, I think. Opera has quickly come up the ladder among subjects to read about. But I read such a wide variety that it's kind of hard to say because, in any given genre of nonfiction, there's not necessarily that many books that I've read. Because I'm reading nonfiction books from a number of different genres. I like to read, occasionally I like to read books about books or literary criticism. I read history occasionally. Biography is really starting to come up as one of my new favorite genres, possibly my new absolute favorite genre. I want to get into reading journals and letters and things of that sort. And I occasionally read science books and books about poetry, so I read a lot of books from a lot of different places, and so I don't feel like I've explored any one area all that well. So saying what my favorite nonfiction subject to read about is a bit weird, but if I had to pick one, it would be religion. Whether it's especially the Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Number 4, do you have a favorite nonfiction book? The first one that came to mind for that question was The Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, which is a very short book written by a Roman emperor. And you wouldn't think that a Roman emperor would, write a really good book about how to live your life and how to approach life and how to have a good attitude towards your life, but Marcus Aurelius did. And yeah, this is definitely one of the most influential books for me, just in how I approach life. It's kind of about how if whatever crap is going on in your life at the moment doesn't turn out well, then it probably still won't kill you. But if it does, then your suffering will be over and you'll be gone, so it won't matter. And that would be the crux of the book, basically, which it sounds super depressing, but is actually, I find, a very liberating way to look at life. Number 5, what do you think keeps people from wanting to read nonfiction? I think people tend to think that nonfiction is either for scholarship or for school. And for me, in terms of my interest in nonfiction, that's fine. I like reading like a scholar. I mean, I read academic articles for my studies in my PhD program and such, so it's something that I'm fine doing, and I don't mind the fact that a lot of my spare time is spent doing it in other, mediums, in books, and in other genres outside of what I study at school. But for a lot of people, that's very off-putting, because, they associate that with drudge work and boredom and, labor and rote memorization and writing essays that you don't want to write. Yeah, my answer isn't all that different from the answer that most people have given, but, I think that that's basically it. Number 6, why do you like nonfiction? I like learning. That's, I think, what the default answer that everyone's been giving to this question, but really, that's kind of the point. But I also have a ton of fun reading nonfiction. I mean, it can be just as fun as fiction, especially something like a biography or a memoir. Certainly, occasionally history. I want to get more into history, but I'm not quite on the history bandwagon that other people are. But even nonfiction outside of those genres that are explicitly narratives of people's lives, you can get a thrill that's very similar to fiction, just from the sort of mind-blowing insight you can get into certain books. For example, a couple years ago, I read Phantoms in the Brain by V.S. Ramachandran and Sandra Blakesley, and it's just all about the brain and how the brain works, and he does it. Ramachandran and Blakesley look at the brain through the lens of people who have experienced brain damage, and what can people with brain damage teach us about how the normal brain functions. And some of the case studies that they go through of patients that V.S. Ramachandran has worked with are just mind-blowing. And it was just such a thrilling book. So there are nonfiction books outside of the sort of explicit narrative nonfiction that can give you a thrill like fiction. Number 7 is, what's a nonfiction book you've read because of BookTube? There are a lot, but the biggest one, the one that I've probably loved the most that came to mind, was Behave, The Biology of Humans at Our Best and Worst by Robert Sapolsky, where he just ambitiously does this gigantic survey of research on neuroscience and psychology and also economics and a couple other fields to just look at how humans function, basically, how they interact with each other. It's basically, the book is an introduction to social psychology, and it's just incredibly impressive. He covers a huge amount of content and covers it really well. It's a really well-written book. It's a big book, but, you will get through it really quickly, whether you're already acquainted with psychology or whether you're a newbie. Number 8 is, what's the best nonfiction book you've read lately? And for me, the first book that came to mind was The Year of Magical Thinking by Joan Didion, which is an incredibly powerful memoir of the year after Joan Didion's husband died very suddenly of a heart condition, and also a memoir of her daughter's struggles with her health, and her being in and out of the hospital, and Joan Didion having to take care of her. And it's just a beautiful exploration of grief and mourning and loss, and just so beautifully written. I highly recommend it. Number 9, what are some of your nonfiction reading goals? My goal for nonfiction is always to try to read more primary sources. I read a lot of old books because I like going to the source of where an idea is from. I like the idea of going and reading books like On the Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, or The Descent of Man by Charles Darwin, or the books of David Hume, or Plato, or Aristotle, and really looking at what they actually wrote, and seeing whether what I've been told over and over again about these thinkers is actually true. Did so-and-so actually say this? Or was what they said being taken out of context or something? I find that to be such a satisfying experience. So I always want to read more primary texts. I already read a fair number, but I want to read even more. And the second goal is to copy more quotes from nonfiction into my commonplace book. Because I feel like when I copy quotes into my commonplace book, I hold on to them better. And they're easier for me to reference because I just have it as a Word document on my computer, and I can just go and, if I remember that there was something in so-and-so book, I can just Control F, search for that book, find the quote, or hopefully find the quote, and it's there. And, and I mean, you can probably guess from that I underline a lot and mark what I read a lot. So yeah, that's a big goal as well. Number 10, what's your advice for incorporating more nonfiction into your reading diet? Look at what documentaries you watch. I'm sure you probably watch documentaries. Look at what YouTube videos you watch. You probably absorb a lot of the same content that you would get through reading nonfiction through documentaries and YouTube videos. Because YouTube videos are such a great way to learn as well as reading. Look at what Wikipedia articles you keep returning to in your spare time. You know, what Wikipedia article have you just returned to time and time again because you're just looking something up, or you know, you want to know more about a person or an event or something. Look at what news articles you gravitate towards. You know, is there an issue inside of the news stories that you're most interested in that you can find a book on? Look at what podcasts you listen to. Is sort of the same deal. Just pick from among those, find a subject that you just can't get enough of, and find a really accessible book to begin with. One book. One really accessible book. Don't start with a 1,000-page history of the French Revolution or something like that. Start with a short, easy book that will be digestible. Ideally a book that's on a subject that you already know something about from the, you know, other stuff you've consumed, so that you're not totally getting your bearings and orientating yourself to the content that the author's going to be talking about. Something you'll find is that the more nonfiction you read, the easier it becomes to read nonfiction, and the more thrilling reading nonfiction gets, because the more you can sort of argue with the author of the nonfiction book. I really like how Steve Donahue said that it's like you're reading a book about your own high school playground. So if you were to read a book by someone else about your own high school playground, you would be arguing with them. You would probably have your own opinions, and you would probably have data to support your own counter-arguments to what they say. And that is an incredibly fun experience. And the more nonfiction you read, the more you'll be able to do that in the books you read. So, but start with the one book and just work from there. I mean, once you have that book down, you can think about more books from there. You know, just start small, one step at a time. So that's what I would recommend. And then there's a bonus question, which is to give some recommendations of nonfiction BookTube channels that you love. I am going to leave links to some channels that I really like who haven't gotten mentioned. And I also tag all of those people. So look in the description to see if I tag you, and look in the description to get the recommendation for the channels. But anyway, that's the nonfiction tag. Thank you to the 4 people who tagged me, and I will talk to you all in my next video. Bye, guys.